Good morning, everyone. A very warm welcome to the last session on Zoom of the season 2 of Military Literature Festival, Lucknow. Today, we again go back to Bollywood to discuss a very interesting book, Bollywood Does Battle. But it is much more than Bollywood because it has got many larger facets. Yesterday or day before, there was a very interesting comment made by the head of the jury at the Goa Film Festival. And it has hit India with a rage when he said that the Bollywood film Kashmir Files is vulgar and certain other things, and therefore we are not even considering it for the artistic film section. Kashmir Files, in a way, is a war movie because India and Pakistan have been at war in Jammu and Kashmir since 1947 and more specifically since 1989. And it happened during those days when thousands of militants had infiltrated to destabilize the state as well as the country. So, how much truth has been told, and how badly it has been told, how well it has been told, we leave it to the judgment of the audience. But we move on today with our last session. We have two very interesting panelists, the author and the moderator. So I will allow the author to be introduced by General Gadkari, and I will say a few words about Major General Nitin Gadkari, who is moderating today's session. He raised the first regiment of Bofors when they came to the Indian Army. He was also in the United Nations as an observer on the Kuwait-Iraq front. He has commanded and operated in the counter-infiltration and counter-terrorism as well as operational areas and has been a trainer. Due to his active involvement in fighting terrorism, he wrote a doctoral thesis on an interesting subject of motivational factors for terrorism. He was commandant of prestigious College of Defense Management at Secunderabad and Deputy Commandant of Army War College at Mao. He's a keen writer and he has written two wonderful books called Oscar Tango, which is a thriller based on J&K and on growing Sino-Nepal relationship and its relation and its policy implications on India, which had been very well received in the government circles. He is also a Ranji Trophy player, an artist of in the field of painting, and he also writes a blog. So over to General Gadkari to steer our honored guest Samir Chopra for next 40 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, General HK. Am I audible?
Yes.
Thank you, General HK. Firstly, thank you for once again introducing me. I'm not new to the Lucknow Military Festival, but I thank you and your team for once again allowing me to moderate the last of the Zoom sessions. And today I'm extremely excited, but there are two things that we're going to do which are very close to my heart. First is the movies. I'm a movie buff, and probably that's what qualifies me to be a moderator today. And second is I love books. And what better than to talk about movies and books together? And it is all thanks to Dr. Samir Chopra, whose book we'll be discussing. I have the honor of introducing Dr. Samir Chopra, and I must make a confession that if he was an ordinary person, I would have probably memorized what I have to talk about him and spoken out of my memory. but I'm afraid he's such a multifaceted personality that I had to take extensive notes. And I will apologize to the viewers if I constantly look down and refer to my notes whenever I'm either speaking about him or asking him the questions. So let me introduce Dr. Sameer Chopra. It's my pleasure to introduce today's panelist, Dr. Sameer Chopra. Dr. Sameer is a multi-dimensional personality. His biography, as I read and inferred from Google, makes a very intriguing reading. And I'm using the word intriguing deliberately as a compliment, for very soon you will know and understand why. Dr. Sameer Chopra is a doctorate in philosophy from Graduate Center and Brooklyn College of the City University of New York. He is currently a professor teaching philosophy in the same college. He completed his BA with honors in mathematical statistics, which I asked him, very interesting, from Delhi University in 1987, and the same year he moved to the US. Later in 1989, he completed his MS in computer sciences from New Jersey Institute of Technology, Newark. In the year 2000, he completed his PhD in philosophy, as I said earlier. He writes regularly on each of these diverse topics, with philosophy at one end of the spectrum and artificial intelligence at the other. And in between, he also writes about Bollywood and cricket. His refereed journals and conferences and talks run into several pages on his CVs. He has also authored 10 books on varied topics. While at one end, a legal theory for autonomous artificial agent is a fascinating treatise on emerging laws of artificial agents. On the other extreme is writing a book on Bollywood and combining it with wars fought by the Indian military. He is also a great cricket enthusiast and has written 3 books on cricket. Dr. Sameer Chopra is the son of an Indian Air Force fighter pilot, squadron leader PC Chopra, who was decorated with a Veer Chakra for bravery in the 1965 Indo-Pak War. It is hard to believe that God would endow one individual with such diverse qualifications and qualities. His work would by itself make a very interesting session for a lit fest, for I could go on describing about his achievements for us. But because today's mandate is to discuss his book, I would end his introduction. Now I'll introduce his book. But before I introduce the book, let me state that the aim of this session should be to bring forth the reality of war to the Indian public and the contribution made by the armed forces, with 2 primary objectives. First, to understand war with an aim to avoid it. And second, understand the evolution of war and its perception by the nation as soon as seen through Bollywood movies. There are some eternal truth about the Indians and the Indian movie fans. Indians love movies in general, yet Indians love their movies to be romantic and with a happy ending. They hate sad endings. But war is essentially destructive by nature, woven with personal tragedies. Thus, there is a dichotomy in the wants and realities. This is the dilemma that haunts an Indian war movie producer or a maker. We will examine Dr. Sameer Chopra's book, Bollywood Does Battle, in light of these realities. In the book, Dr. Sameer writes about the role and involvement of Bollywood in bringing to fore the wars that the Indian military has fought. He has covered the period between 1947 and the Kargil War. His book covers 8 movies as an example which amplify his thought. These are Hakikat, Akraman, Hindustan Ki Kasam, Border, LOC, Kargil, Lakshya, Vijayata, and finally the Ghazi attack. Of this, Hakikat deals with the 1962 Indo-China War. Rest all of them deal with the wars with Pakistan fought in various years. And finally, the author expounds his thoughts on the shortfalls of Indian war movies, their reasons, and what they lack. The last chapter of his book, in fact, by the last chapter, I would say his subtext is more important than the text. And he said more to think about than what he has written. And that what intrigues me more. And it is a must for all movie enthusiasts and buff. With that, I welcome Dr. Samir Chopra, and I apologize if I made any statistical or factual errors while describing him or his life. I will also take this opportunity to set small rules. We are here for 40 minutes as part of the discussion. Thereafter, we'll go through the question answer sessions. Viewers can put the questions in the chat box to either Journal HK or me. And finally, after the question answer session, I'll request Journal HK to sum up the proceedings. With that, I welcome Dr. Samir Chopra and start with a question so that he gets an opportunity to talk about himself and if there are some gaps that has been left. And let me connect the last, what I said in the introduction, that how is it that you're able to seamlessly tie so many varied, professions and so many varied high-end interests at the same time while you are doing so many things. And also you can fill in the gaps of whatever I left out in your bio. Yeah, Samir.
Nitin, thanks very much for that extraordinarily generous introduction. I think the best way to answer that question is, I think I just happen to have I guess a diverse range of interests and curiosities, and I think I followed them to the best of my abilities and pursued them, in the ways that best suited me. I said to you yesterday that I was a very generic Indian because I was interested in cricket and the movies, and all that's left now is that I need to write a book on the trains, and I'll be and then I can die happy. But I think these were things that always interested me. These were things that held my curiosity, and there is a certain thread that connects them, which happens because different interests comes up in one's life, and as and when we find them of sufficient interest, we sort of chase them down. I think the difference is perhaps that sometimes I was willing to chase them a little bit further at times and make partial careers or turn them into objects of authorly interest. And that kind of connects me to the book that you introduced, because when I started to think about a book on Indian war movies, it was because I'd previously been writing a book on Indian military aviation history, which is a book on the 1965 air war with Pakistan. And when I'd been writing that book and actually writing it with India's actually, I think, foremost aviation historian, PVS Jagan Mohan, who had invited me to just work on the book with him. And as I was working on the book with him, because I had a personal interest in the Indian Air Force, and I think that is one feature of my interest, that I have a personal stake in some ways in the projects that I take on. And so in my case, my father had been a pilot in the Indian Air Force. He had fought in both these wars. He had fought in the 65 war and in the 1971 war. So in some ways, but I'd lost him as a young, as an adolescent, because he had died not as a very old man at all, as a rather young man. So in some ways, doing research on Indian military aviation history was also kind of a discovery of personal archaeology and genealogy to find out a bit more about my father. So it's quite a personal project. And as I researched the project, or as I worked on the project, I noticed that Indian military history was, not as rich or varied or extensive as was befitting a country that had quite as an extensive a military history as India did. And it struck me that there were so many ways in which India understood wars that didn't lie outside, that actually lay outside of military history. And one of them had to be movies, because if there's one place in our culture that Indians learn about themselves, they learn about other Indians, they learn very much about what it is to be Indian in some ways. It's through movies. I mean, and I think India through the Indian cinematic lens is quite a common trope, and I'm not new in saying this, that there's a lot to be learned about India just by watching Indian movies in some ways. And even if someone says, oh, that's a caricatured Bollywood version, it's an interesting question to ask. Why does this culture have a caricatured Bollywood version of itself that it pumps out in thousands of movies every year, right? So all those questions are, and I thought, well, how does India think about war? How does it represent war? How does it represent these wars that I'm thinking about? And I thought that and I thought the best way to do it was to, just like, in some ways explore these movies. So initially it began as a bit of a movie watching project. I just sort of collected all the DVDs. I started, and then, I've always been watching war movies my life because I've been a military history buff, growing up in a military family and having a literary bent of mind as well. And I realized that it was interesting that there was a very small cluster of movies that we could call Indian war movies. And I'd seen many, many other war movies made by other nations. And, and I realized, as you always do, when you think about the history of the world, the histories of the great powers of the world are a very extensive military histories. If you would read military histories of nations like, the United Kingdom or the United States, they would fill miles of bookshelves, right? The great powers of the world are in some ways known by their military histories. And this is kind of and in many ways, those countries understand themselves through their military histories as well, quite extensively. So part of my curiosity about movies came about because Indian movies represented a significant cultural slice that could offer a reflection of the Indian imagination about movies. And so I started by just reading the movies in this case. And then the idea for a book took shape from that form onwards.
Okay, I think that's well stated. And my next question comes to you, and I'm trying to collect a conversation which took place in the last discussion on 26. Am I audible, Samir? Am I audible?
Yes, very much so.
So, what you have answered this question partially, but how do you classify a movie to be either a war movie? And General HK also mentioned the same thing about Kashmir File. In your opinion, because there was a dichotomy of view in the last time, how do you classify? And in some way, if you can also explain, what is the necessity of a nation to produce war movies? You have expounded it very beautifully in your book. So if you could
So, that first question about what constitutes a war movie, or what is a war movie, or what defines a war movie, what I did was I offered a kind of a tentative definition that I would use in the book, which would allow me to make a selection, right? Because I obviously realized the selection was very large, depending on various kinds of definitional criteria. So I use the definition of a war movie in the Indian context. So for me, an Indian war movie is a movie made about a war where there is a declared public conflict against an identified external enemy. So, for example, there are these so-called what I call Ugravadi movies, right? They're movies about terrorist internal attacks and insurgencies and conspiracies, and those are not. They might have action, they might have combat sequences, but they're not war movies. Because for me, in this definition, there has to be the nation is going to war, right? And it is a declared war, and an enemy has been identified, right? So there has to be, in some ways, there was also a kind of there had to be some clash of nationalist ideologies involved out here, not just, the evil terrorist who has some unspecified ideology behind him, right? So I use that as a kind of a working definition for the book. And I acknowledge two things. One, this leaves out obviously many movies and they deserve separate treatment. Secondly, I am admittedly parochial in my outlook in this movie because as an Indian, I have to make this confession. I did not consider regional cinema. And in fact, just using the word regional cinema is horrible. I did not consider non-Hindi cinema or movies that were made outside of Bombay because I did not speak the language. I'm not sufficiently fluent. And so I wanted to be able to pay text to the scripts quite closely, and I felt I would do best justice if I considered just Hindi films. So it is an admittedly narrow subset, yes.
Okay. And
Not narrow, but a restricted subset in some ways,
okay,
yes.
okay. And why do you think is it necessary to make a war movie? Yeah.
Right,
Yeah.
right.
So
Now,
that's an important question.
yeah, so I don't know if I would use say necessary, but I would say that it is almost as if movies have been found to be a vehicle by which cultures and nations cultures and nations, I would say, have expressed their thoughts on what war means to them, and what war means to the nation that is fighting the war, or that is about to go to war, or that is now reflecting on a war that it has fought, right? And that says something about the primacy of cinema as like a cultural tool through which these kinds of thoughts are expressed, so that when a nation or a culture thinks about how it has to express itself, obviously it does through books and maybe poetry, but movies especially, and also because of their implication in things like propaganda, right? But I mean, in some ways, sometimes people say, well, war movies are a propaganda vehicle, but they're not just a propaganda movie. I mean, you can make war movies that criticize war as well. So I think it's because of the power of the medium, and I think at some self-conscious level or at some subconscious level, nations and cultures do find themselves confronted with this question, and they will answer it explicitly or implicitly. Why are we fighting this war? Right? Why are we going to war? And when we fight war, we ask people to kill other people, to commit acts that we consider the worst of all in the name of certain ideals. What are these ideals that we have identified that are worth killing other people for? And what are these ideals that we have identified that we are willing to die for? Right?
Yeah,
so these questions, I think we need to...
These are, in fact, this is the subtext that I'm talking about, that while you've written a book on Bollywood, yet there are questions which hound a nation as to why do you go for war, and you probably said that also in your book. Okay, let me get to the next question, which I thought will be more interesting. When you talk of movies in India and we talk of war movies, every Indian, if we understand, straight away starts talking about Private Ryan, Saving Private Ryan, or talk about Longest Day or Bridge Too Far or Black Hawk Down. Now, if you see all these movies, they're made by very, very prominent, successful directors. And I've got this whole list of 10, 20, David Lean, David Attenborough, Steven Spielberg, Clint Eastwood, Sam Mendes, and Christopher Nolan, Dunkirk. So in the Hollywood, movies have been successful because they have been made by very, very well-known, renowned directors. When we take this equation into Bollywood, I can't recollect more than J.P. Datta and Chetan Anand who have been constant with the war movies. So many directors haven't really experimented with going into... so there is a connect or disconnect to say that unless people of good technical abilities try and make war movies, the war movie will not come out to be as successful as they have been in the Hollywood. So what do you have to say to that?
Yeah, I think there are two aspects to this, right? One is, of course, the technical quality of the movie, and of course, part of the technical quality of the movies, of course, is the writing of the movie, right? Is the actual the work put into the story that's being written in the movie. Now, I think as you pointed out, directors of some accomplishment have taken on the war movie in India, and in some ways, the war movie as a genre is even visible in the Indian movie. But I would agree that the Indian war movie is, as a kind of vehicle of action, or even a vehicle of the various kinds of messages that people have made in war movies in the past, is, at least on the technical front, and that's something that I go over in the final chapter. On the technical front, it is considerably less accomplished. Part of this is, whether it is the attention paid to the actual cinematic working, the effort that it needs to make a movie like the war movie, which is a particular blend of the action movie plus a drama movie. The fact that I think cooperation and between, you might have technical advisors, or for example, sufficient investment in the technical aspects of the war movie, or even even the historic aspects. I mean, for example, I think Indian war movies suffer quite considerably on just the military history aspect of the kinds of stories that they tell in many ways. So I think there are deficiencies actually on all those counts.
I will come to that because you expound that with Ghazi, and I'll question you on that subject. But I want to ask you, my next question is, when you talk of war movies abroad, it is Saving Private Ryan, but in Indian context, it is always Hakikat.
Right.
First question yesterday also somebody asked me, has he mentioned Hakikat? Now imagine Hakikat was made in 1964.
Right.
And it took 40 years for Border to come out of any significance note, So
right.
My question is, why did it take 40 years for somebody to make a movie, a war movie, or how come somebody 40 years back make a war movie which still, resonates in the Indian psyche? So you have mentioned a lot about Hakikat. Would you like to, expound your thoughts?
Thanks. I think that distinction you pointed out is very interesting, and I think Hakikat is a very interesting movie precisely for a couple of reasons. One, it was made very soon after the 1962 war had ended. It came out in 1964, which is relatively recent, though not lightning speed. Memories were still fresh. It was made on location, so it has a great deal of cinematic value in its depiction of the kinds of wastelands that it showed. And it showed, I think, the harshness and the severity of the landscape and the conditions under which the Indian Army fought. It's frankly speaking quite under quite brutal conditions, and I think people came to appreciate that. And I think there was, in many ways, there are some very standard formulaic Bollywood aspects in that movie, but yet it stays, the military narrative is by and far central. Yes. There is a romance on the side because, the handsome Lieutenant Dharmendra is in love with the local Ladakhi woman, and he's very gentlemanly, and he's chaperoning her younger brother around, and it's very discreet and very chaste, and the military narrative remains central. And the whole movie is full of military iconography, uniforms, weapons, the insides of soldiers' tents. So it is a much richer movie in that visual regard as well. Yeah. And I think many of the movies that came after that were simply nowhere near as, I think, rich or complicated. And it showed an Indian defeat. It showed defeat. A large part of the movie was dedicated to showing a very brutal retreat.
Yes.
And the Major Balraj Sahni has to sing an inspirational song to get his men marching again. His soldiers are not just like the chest beating forward type. These men are beaten. Their toes are falling off. They're suffering from frostbite, and they don't want to go on at night. And he says, no, we have to go on. And I think it brought across the starkness, and I think of war and the brutality of war. I think in a way that people understood that they were seeing something that was made with a sincere attempt to tell the truth.
I agree with that. And in fact, you have mentioned in your book that post-border or post-LOC, the status of the Indian soldier has now become equivalent to the Indian cricketer, where anything against him is blasphemous. And people just don't like. So where does criticism fall in? You cannot in any way criticize, Indian soldier or an Indian, a war effort. You mentioned that in it. So,
right. Well, I think that's a powerful point to pick on, because I think good military history, or what we might call useful or valuable military history, is something that is genuinely instructive, and it is instructive insofar as it allows us to learn from our mistakes. Right. I mean, that would be the most basic sort of lesson that one would expect from a military history. And military history would be a rather, I think, I would say, might be entertaining to read a long recitation of victories, and to read a long list of pages that basically read like medal citations, but they're not useful or instructive at all to anybody who plans to go into war. They're not useful to a nation that thinks whether it should go into war, and they're not useful for citizens who need to understand why is it that my nation is entering us, all of us, into something that is going to call upon us possibly to make the most ultimate sacrifice of all. So war is not a trivial business, and anything having to do with it should be inspected with the utmost severity.
I agree. Okay, I'll take on my next question, and which relates to this change. And in your book, you are disappointed with the way Akraman or Hindustan Ki Kasam has shown the action scenes, and especially Hindustan Ki Kasam. And I also watched it after reading your book, and I was utterly disappointed. But you are very, what should I say, very praiseful of Ghazi, the submarine attack, where you feel that technically it is a far more superior movie than any other. Now, my question relates to the fact that what has changed over the years? Is it the technology? Is it the audience taste, or is it understanding of the war? Okay, and then I'm not putting it back to say that in 1964, when Hakikat was made, at the same time, Bridge Too Far was also made. And in 1961, Hollywood had already successfully taken out a movie called Guns of Navarone, which was essentially again a war movie. So if it was purely technology, then the answer does not really, it doesn't answer that how come Bridge Too Far was so successful way back. So can you, it's a little complex question, but whatever your thoughts.
Yeah, no. I would say it is not purely technological. I'd say if I was going to be film theoretical, I would say there is a certain kind of what film theorists like to call the grammar of a certain kind of genre of filmmaking, right? So if I am going to make, for example, I'm going to make a noir movie, right? There's a certain kind of lighting I have to use. There's a certain way my action scenes have to be staged. There's a certain kind of way that the dialogue is written. And I would say that in that technology, that kind of technique, that kind of combination of what I would say script writing, cinematic techniques, and I would say directorial techniques, I think those, quite frankly speaking, were simply not developed enough in Indian filmmaking at the time. And even in Hakikat, for example, Hakikat there are some elements of Hakikat's war movie grammar that somebody would say are not sophisticated in some film theoretical way, but the movie is able to convey a certain kind of emotional way through its other visuals, right? So to the audience who is watching it, which is trained on one kind of grammar, Hakikat makes a very powerful impact, right? I mean, if I've grown up watching the Sunday feature film in Delhi, and then I am exposed to Hakikat, I have been trained on the Indian movie grammar, and I understand Hakikat within that framework, right? But if you were to compare Hakikat to a war movie that was made in the 1960s in Hollywood, it will not compare in similar sophistication, because by that time, Hollywood war movies, they'd been making war movies for 30 years by that time.
Okay.
Okay.
That is
and I think in Ghazi, by the way, I will say this about Ghazi. Ghazi is definitely a visually more slick movie. But I would say in many of, for example, its like officer-like interactions and some of its character depictions, it is less sophisticated than Hakikat. For example, I think it's its commanding officer, for instance, right?
Yeah,
Sometimes
I have a question for you on that. I'll take that question a little later. But adding to the thing about technology, the success of Top Gun Maverick recently, do you think in coming times technology will overtake the story part? Because Top Gun Maverick had a very weak story.
Yes, very much so. And I mean, a classic cliche in some ways, in all these ways. But I think it's also in some of these movies, there's just like, it's a certain kind of eye candy, right? And there's a certain kind of star vehicle power that someone like Tom Cruise has. And it operates under a very different marketing apparatus as well, right?
But do you think it will work in Bollywood? Do you think
what's that?
Will it work in Bollywood, this formula about Tom Cruise? Will it work in Bollywood?
I mean, we do have star power in Bollywood that could make certain kinds of movies work regardless of what the content is. I'm not sure, who happens to be number one in Bollywood right now in terms of their absolute drawing power, or that could command a movie that could, turn or make people overlook aspects of it that are not, sufficiently, shall we say, technically satisfying or even satisfying from the story's perspective, right?
HK, how much time do I have? Can I ask two more questions?
Enough time.
Enough time. Okay.
There is no bar.
In fact, that brings me to my question, which I've left earlier, Sameer, that you've been critical about the way Bollywood movies are made without context or political background and strategic and tactical understanding of the battle. But do you think this criticism is fair given the fact that the audience for which the movie is made is grossly ignorant about such matters? And you too mentioned in your book that most Indians have never encountered a soldier, let alone known a dead one. Quote from your book. There are so many quotes I have from your book, but this is one of that.
Right,
Do you think this criticism is fair, that Bollywood is, after all, it's a commercial venture. So if the audience do not understand war and military history, then the movies will be accordingly made. So what do you have to say about that?
It's interesting to think about which way, in some ways, I think as culture producers, if we could use that kind of word for people who are writers, artists, poets, filmmakers, I think in some ways we create our audiences, right? And this is a kind of a synergistic kind of way. If there are people that are writing good books out there, there will be people who will read those good books, and if there are people who will read those good books, they'll be able to appreciate good movies. But people will appreciate those good movies, or people will be able to appreciate books in ways if they have read movies in certain ways. So I think in some ways, I think we should make the movies that we think will result in good movies that are in accord with some aesthetic sense that we have. And I think we can also have a better, a better assessment of our audience in the way that maybe demand more of them in some ways, right? We expect more of them in certain ways, so that the movie is not so much a kind of leisurely stroll, but the movie is a bit of a challenge as well. Right, the movie is a challenge, perhaps
leaves the thought, leaves the question, leaves
but introspection. Perhaps it's a moral challenge, or perhaps it's an intellectual challenge, right?
But still, it's a commercial venture. No producer will go in for a movie which he thinks will tank, and that is one of the reasons. Like a movie like LOC, in spite of his best efforts, JP Datta did not succeed. So these are the challenges that a movie maker has.
Yes, yeah, and I would say this is true of any cinematic industry, that there are movies that are that we would call pop movies that we would call like blockbuster movies, and there are movies that are that straddle the line, and sometimes we have crossover hits, for instance, right? And I think I think the challenge, I think, genuinely, is for someone to be able to make a movie that appeals to a kind of sensibility which is perhaps broader and more universal, and yet manages to package it in a vehicle. We get genuinely deep novels that are bestsellers, right? And I think that's because, not every novel that sells is some kind of fluffy, insert your name of your favorite pop author here, Barbara Cartland or Chetan Bhagat or whoever it is. It's not. Some of the greatest novelists of the world have also been some of the most popular novelists too, right?
In fact, this point did come up in the last session also. Okay, I'll get down to the next question, which is somewhat related, and this has been haunting me also. And the question, and it's a statement: the existential disconnect which exists between aspiration of younger generation and the task of defending the nation, which in your book has been admirably captured in Lakshya and Vijayata. Is this gap, the existential difference between younger generation and joining the military, in your opinion, do you think it is likely to grow with the times, thereby making war movies, pure war movies in Bollywood, irrelevant? Or do you think that this should increase, in the sense the war movies should increase so as to boost more and better talent in the armed forces? Like Top Gun had in the last session it came out, Top Gun had a spin-off that the recruitment in the US Army and Marines Navy zoomed, because everyone coming out of, they had put stalls outside the movie theaters of recruitment, and people just came, boys came, and they say, okay, I want to go. So what do you think? Is this possible? What is your views?
I'm not sure if I heard you say what I would recommend the war movie function as, or what kinds of war movies should be made. What I think is interesting to see what kind of war movies India is producing in the last few years, and why is it that directors and producers think that making movies of this particular kind, right, whatever it is that they're making, how is it that they are conveying the reasons that India goes to war? How is it that India views that war? Because in some ways, yes, as you point out, they might have an effect on someone thinking about, why they might want to serve in the armed forces. But I mean, I'm not sure if they intended to function as, say, recruiting vehicles. But insofar as someone sees the depiction of war in them, I would be very interested in seeing what is being conveyed about what is war being portrayed as, and what is it that is portrayed are the reasons for why this war is being fought. And if, what is the cause that is being suggested to us as to why somebody should be prepared forward to step forward and actually give his life for it, right? That identification is very important. And I think the war movie can identify that.
It's a larger question. It's a difficult question to answer or address. It's not so easy to address the youth of a nation as huge and large and varied as us. Okay, I'll get on to my second last question, which is something to do with the way Bollywood directors twist the narrative. Now, I'm citing the example of your Ghazi attack. I have a long statement written. I'll read it and then probably expound on this. The Ghazi attack submarine movie, the idea that the Pakistani counterpart, the captain of the Ghazi, was a better professional than the captain of the Indian submarine S-21. Nothing wrong about that, but the system of keeping a political commissar on the captain in form of Lieutenant Commander Arjun Verma, who is Rana Durga what is his name? Yeah, who's captain who's supposedly a maverick, Captain Ranvijay, commander of the sub, is not a system that is followed in the Indian Navy. And I must here state that any naval officer, if he shows an iota of madness, will never get to command a submarine. However, this whole thing has been twisted in Ghazi attack, and the movie has been shown in that perspective. It's a different matter that he turns in the later part of the movie. But do you think, my question is, do you think twisting the reality to suit Bollywood taste is a good practice, or should the censors have taken objections to such wrong depictions of reality for better image of the service? So this is a larger question involved in this.
No, I don't think, I think my views on the censorship question would be that I think that would be a bad idea, just because I think that image of the services, if depicted, is, like I said, it's a kind of absurd depiction. But I think the answer to that is not to censor it. I think the answer would be to either, have, a dialogue about the movie, like, for instance, I think discussions like this, articles like this, a critical review in a newspaper, an essay, a question and answer session with the director, or maybe an invitation from, ex-military officers, or maybe even the services to arrange for technical advisors. On Band of Brothers and these movies, they had, Stephen Ambrose, they had military historians, they had technical advisors from the Marines working with them. So if that kind of cooperation could be possible, then I'm sure the services could could cooperate in a movie that could, I think there are great stories to be told about the conduct of military operations that would benefit from technical detail. And I think one of the impressive things about the Ghazi was precisely that there was some attention paid to those technical details, sonar soundings, adjusting the dials, depth sounds, there was more technical detail. And I think that made it more authentic in certain ways, right? But to go back to your earlier question, that I think I think the fact that this, I think it says something about the movie, about the way we like to make movie, and about the way that we understand heroism or bravery as a whole. That bravery means never being afraid, right? Or bravery means that you cannot be anything but a die-hard Paramveer martyr, right? Bravery, my father fought in 2 wars, right? And he said to me, he says, everybody gets scared in war. He says the brave people are the ones who continue to function while they're scared. He says that's what being brave means.
Absolutely.
He says everybody gets scared. You just got to do your job and get through with it. He says nobody stands around thumping their bloody chests. So get this idea out of your head. So I think depictions of soldiers that show them as chest thumping, types are not, they're not fairly representative. But I think the idea for that is that people should actually have, I think this is what I said, if we had better military history, people who would go to the movies would say, man, this is crap. If we had better military history, right? And I think in some ways, I think what the movies also show up is that as a culture, for example, military history is not a fully blown academic subject in Indian universities. It should be.
It should be. I agree.
It should be. There are thousands of crores being spent on wars. What are we spending them on, right? What policies are being pursued? I mean, these are questions that every democracy should be open to, right? So military history should be it should be an academic subject. There should be people writing PhDs on India's wars and examining what were all the mistakes, what were all the things that went right, what were the geopolitical implications, what have been the implications on our economy. And I think when people have that kind of understanding that war is this very complicated phenomenon, if they go and see simplistic representations on the screen, their dislike of those movies might make directors reconsider that maybe we need to make more sophisticated movies because we have a more sophisticated audience. Right? So I think the education of the audience and the education of the directors of the movie sort of proceeds hand in hand, because after all, the directors are coming from that same audience in some ways, right?
Samir, I have a million questions for you, but I'm sure General HK is looking at time, and I will leave my part with one final question. And that is, are you optimistic about Bollywood making good war movies in future, or do you think they should give way to the OTT platform?
I think that my earlier comment, I think, is still relevant in the sense that my earlier is that I think I think it will be a function of the broader academic culture about war and about the broader understanding of war, and something, hopefully, as people understand the reasons why India went to war and how these wars were fought, hopefully that will produce more sophisticated war movies. I don't know if I can say I'm optimistic, but I have been struck that there are two trends. I think that Hemant had mentioned as well, that there's far more military history being written now, right? So at least right now we have the quality, and I think the quantity of that will come to be over a period of time as the work is disseminated, and I think that might change the quality of Indian movies down the line as well.
Okay, thanks, Samir. Thanks for our discussion, and I'll just make a comment that the whole idea of war movies is so complex, and your book is at various levels, and you talk about foreign policy and Arabian policy. So much you have discussed that your introduction and your conclusion, the 2 chapters, have far more depth than what you've written in the 160 pages in between. But notwithstanding that, it is not a simple subject that can be just brushed aside. So while there may be a lot of audience who might be thinking, why did we not discuss about border or LOC and the nuances of whether Amitabh Bachchan was a better Batra, or whether Siddharth Malhotra had done a better job. But I want to ask you this question: did Sher Shah not was released when you wrote this book, or was it released when it?
No, it had not been released.
Because had you probably covered Sher Shah, you would have got a little more, different, because I watched Sher Shah just yesterday after, and I found it is probably one of the better movies made, even in terms of war depiction, than all of them put together, apart from Hakikat. Of course, Sher Shah also has this Bollywoodish love, romance, everything, but yet it's still portrayed in a more realistic manner. And I think maybe a sequel to it, Sher Shah has definitely been, I think it was also awarded the best movie, if I'm not wrong. So I will end on that note to say that thank you very much. It's a very complex subject, and if we are disappointed the audience by not discussing a particular movie, then it's my apologies. But I thought it's essential for all of us to understand the larger context of why war movies in Bollywood are a must, and they must continue in the manner in which you have stated in your book. Thank you. And now we can take on the question answers. HK, do you have any questions?
Yes.
Well, some in the chat that I see, if that's the source that you want to use for the questions, right? That would be appropriate, I suppose.
Yeah.
Yes.
So I'm just scrolling down. Hemant, would you like me to just take the questions in sequence on the chat?
Yeah. Actually, first question was put by me. It's more of a comment. You take it on.
Yeah. So I think your first, if you see the first question by Hemant, poor state of Indian military history, it is an important statement. Hakikat finished with a woman donating jewelry. But when we research about those massive donations by people, nothing is found but a few official clips. Why do we hide our military history? I think at this point, I think got addressed in our discussion. This is a kind of, function. I think overwhelmingly, I think this is a broader question about just how much history is written in India. I think, when, if you really think about even just post-independence India from 1947 till this is 75 years, for a country of India's size and complexity, our history is minuscule. The amount of, and there are entire, subtexts, sub-chapters of our history that are so incredibly rich, that deserve so much more academic treatment, that one's mind boggles at the number of projects out there we're waiting to be taken on to adequately adequate. So I think this is a much broader complaint. I want to move on to something that you asked me that I think is a little bit more difficult question for me to answer. When you said, why do I think war will come again, or India will see larger wars? I think when I wrote this, I was perhaps in a slightly pessimistic mood about, the geopolitical situation in India's neighborhood, and yeah, so I think it was perhaps it was a slightly throwaway line, but my sense was that, that war is, war has been a feature of our subcontinent. I'm not sure if I would hold to a deterministic view that war will come again, but it was a sense of, I think, probably just striking a note of geopolitical pessimism at that time. I don't think I meant to be Nostradamus, but one thing is, I think it is much clearer that the stakes are much larger in the wars that might occur. And I think, yeah, so even in some ways, the questions of whether war should be fought is perhaps even more fraught, right? That was perhaps my way of making that point. There's a question from a Mr. Abraham Cherian, and I think I'm just going to be able to take that on in a second. Hang on, let me just see. I say, so first, okay, there's a question from Ritesh Singh Yadav. What could be the themes for making good war movies in reference to literature and films? Ritesh, I think one of the things that I pointed out in my introduction is that within war movies, there are many genres that are captured, and one classic genre is the so-called combat genre, right? Which is some soldiers fighting a certain kind of mission, right? And this has very, very definite tropes associated with it. And I think one of the things about war movies is that kind of trope of a group of soldiers going off to fight a mission can very easily map on to many abstract themes that are found in literature, right? Stories of brotherhood, stories of discovery, stories of adventure. And I think that's partly why the war movie has been such a popular vehicle, because besides having action and besides having tales, moral lessons taught, there are also themes that are abstract archetypes that we have learned by by reading stories and comic books as we grew up, right? So war movies are also adventure movies in some ways, right? And I think that's why, and I think that's why they're as successful as they are. Okay, just continuing down the chats. Abraham Cherian. What do you think of the lack of depiction of the strategy, higher organization, and preparation for war, beyond showing tactical battles and distorted versions seen in a couple of recent movies? Yeah, very good question. What do I think of it? I think it is a serious weakness in Indian war movies. I think at least in the movies that were made in the 1970s and 80s, this was a particular weakness where quite literally we had no idea why this war was happening. I mean, it's actually quite stunning. If you see Hindustan Ki Kasam, there's a party going on at the Indian Air Force officers' mess. And then all of a sudden there's an air raid. And then chalo ji, war shuru ho gayi. I was like, okay, who has launched this war? Dushman. Okay. And so all we know is the enemy has attacked, right? And even in Akraman, right? The major is at lunch and says, Dushman ne hamla kiya hai. We have no idea why this war has started. It's almost like someone saying, oh, it started raining. Let's all get umbrellas, right? I mean, but war is not a force of nature. War is a very deliberate political act. It is the most ultimate of political weapons, and it is the heaviest decision a nation can take. So why is this being shown so flippantly, right? So and moreover, it's the recounting of what the geopolitical setting was, what the local setting was, strategically, of course. Strategic is rare even in advanced war movies, to show that kind of level, unless you are showing a kind of unless your concentration is at that strategic level. Like, for example, if say you were showing if you were making a movie about Hitler or Churchill or someone, right, you would be showing war room operations but I doubt that anybody would show command level operations except in a very few war movies. But even then, you're entirely right. Most of the depictions of the movies that we get in Indian war movies are very superficial. And in fact, by and large, I think there are, in only a couple of war movies, are there any conversations that happen that would resemble anything like a military conversation would actually take place, right? So I think in Hakikat, there are some good technical conversations and a couple of the later good war movies, but in Akraman, Hindustan Ki Kasam, these conversations are very, very superficial to the point of almost being inane. But like I said, there is definitely a trend now to have technical slickness, right? Sometimes almost in an overwhelming fashion. There's a lot of like CGI and graphics effects. So it's almost tending a little bit too closely to video game style depiction of action, right? But there are, I think there is, for example, in Ghazi Attack, there's this, what I call a kind of a voiceover narrative style introduction, which is a black screen. And, in 1971, this war happened for this reason. And actually, I think it's read by Amitabh Bachchan. It's a very deep voice, and he kind of tells you this sober story leading up to the war. And that's quite a departure from Indian movies. Most Indian movies don't have that kind of background. Yeah, so I would say my reaction to that is that it's something that's actually quite a serious weakness, right? This is a question and comment from Brigadier B.N. Singh. Serious cinema has never been a favorite of Bollywood. Instead, light entertainment does commercially well. So producers always balance the mix of the two. The war movies, India has never initiated war against its neighbors. So there is a victimhood story and victimhood factor in storyline. And by the way, this is quite common to war movies. It's very uncommon. Most war movies are of the form that we didn't want to fight, but it was forced upon us, right? That's quite common. Now, advanced technology can produce very realistic war scenes, and there is tremendous scope of work on war films. Unfortunately, Bollywood lacks right exposure to understand the war techniques, motivation of national resources to project as national power. I would definitely say that, I think this is something I was saying to Nitin earlier. I think that there is what I would call, a certain kind of institutional knowledge of doing a certain kind of work, right? I mean, in the army, I'm sure you'd be familiar with this, that, you know, there's a certain kind of work that gets transmitted because people within the system know it, and it is part of the organizational knowledge in some ways, right? I think there's a similar kind of technical knowledge of how to make war movies and what war movies are. And I think some aspects of those are, I think, now present in Indian war movies. But I think some of those, and I think the examples of Band of Brothers is a very good example. I think some elements of those techniques are still missing. And I think in some ways, I think there was one movie that I saw right at the end as the book was getting released, which is Yuri, Surgical Strike, right? Uri Surgical Strike. And that movie struck me as quite an interesting departure from movies that I'd seen before. It didn't really fit into my categorization, and it was a little too late, so I didn't include it. But I was struck in that movie how some aspects of, there's a lot of political depiction in that movie. You know, there's prime ministers and secretaries and those levels of conversations taking place. You know, there's intelligence officers, right? There's there are depictions of politicians and high-level army people. You know, whatever you think about the way in which it is depicted, at least those aspects are being brought into the war movie, right? There is some placement of it within some kind of larger sense, and there is a television news broadcast about something that shows that how people are perceiving it. Obviously, the action scenes are much more sophisticated, right? Even some of what we might call the kind of what I had called in my movies, in my reading of the Indian movies, that sometimes there's certain what we might call national integration messages that are being sent through the movies, right? That in Yuri was done in a very interesting and sort of subtle fashion. I thought that rather than having a lot of kind of overt dialogue about the secularism of India, there was just this one scene where Vicky Kaushal walks past some Indian soldiers who are performing namaz, and he just looks at them and he keeps walking. There's nothing said. It's sort of done in a more understated fashion in some ways, right? So there's a kind of confidence in filmmaking that comes with feeling like you can make your point without needing to beat the viewer over the head with it. There's a kind of sophistication that maybe the writer also feels, the artist also feels, and the filmmaker can feel like I can make this point, right? And I don't need to necessarily slap the viewer upside the head with it. So, and I think that's greater maturity in the genre, right? In Indian filmmakers like Bimal Roy, back in the 50s, who made movies in that certain neo-realist style, were very sophisticated filmmakers in that genre, right? They had a lot of practice on it, and so I think this is one place where I think there are different imperatives right now for making war movies, right? And I think those imperatives sometimes tilt Indian war movies in a particular direction. Let me see if there's more questions. One question from RP. War movies made are far off from reality and more gets added glamour than the truthfulness. Is it because of political government interference or money-making attempt? The lack of realism or the lack of sophistication in these movies, right, which one might say present a lopsided view of war or present a caricatured view of war. I am not sure as to how I would diagnose that, except that it's a combination of what the filmmaker is keen to depict and what the filmmaker thinks people are going to like. So it's in some ways they have read the room, or at least they think they have read the room in the sense of being able to gauge what people's feelings and likes are. And they think that this is a movie that will appeal, right, to folks. Now, it is to be admitted, back in the 1970s and 80s, there was an explicit directive from the Ministry of Information and Broadcasting that countries with whom India had diplomatic relations were not to be depicted in a negative light, right? So when you made a movie like Akraman, for instance, you could not even say Pakistan, for instance. You had to keep on saying Dushman, 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 right? And there are men with green uniforms who are talking about Islam and saying kafirs and all this kind of stuff. So, but you're not allowed to call them Pakistanis, right? Because this is a directive from the Indian government. And this was, by the way, only changed when border was made, because JP Datta explicitly made a request to the Ministry of Information and Broadcasting and said, look, I want to make this movie, and this movie needs to make all these frank statements about how the war was fought. And the Ministry of Information and Broadcasting relaxed the directive at that time, and it has had a significant difference on the way that movies are made. Enemies can be named explicitly, and you can say things about them. If you look at LOC Kargil, right, that is a very different movie from, say, something like Akraman, right? The enemy in two cases is the same, but the enemy is named, identified, characterized very differently, right? So in that sense, there is an explicit sort of directive, I would say, from the yeah, and the question from Anchit, and this goes back to the discussion, Nitin, we had earlier about the lack of adequate, sophisticated military history. Isn't the lack of depth, sophistication, excesses of jingoism of war movies a reflection of the societal literacy levels and inability to absorb details, technical? A glimpse of the current age, Instagram, Twitter, Facebook content also reflects a similar pattern, it seems. Yeah, and I think I think this is exactly right. I think that in some ways, the lack of adequate military history, and maybe if you wanted to embed it even in a broader context, right? The lack of, if someone wanted to say, I don't know if I would say lack of, or in some ways, adequate knowledge about the reality of the phenomenon that's being depicted on the screen, in some ways doesn't equip us, someone would say, with the critical apparatus that's necessary to critique what we're seeing on the screen, right? And if what we understand of the depiction of wars is that they seem like video games fought by supermen, then there's a danger of misrepresentation of the war. But there is some kind of, shall I say, cultural representation of that war in any case that is preparing them for such a depiction of war. So I think these things are definitely locked in a kind of, or not locked, but there's a kind of an interfeed of the movie being produced by the culture that surrounds it is in some ways a reflection of that, right, as well, at least as it understands war, right? At least as it understands war. It is both creating that impression, and it is both a function of that surrounding culture.
Then Gadkari, then I will just sum it up. I will just say a vote of thanks.
Yeah. Okay. Firstly, let me thank Sameer for having come on this show. And what you've done is you opened a new genre of discussion altogether and taken it to a level. Your book has taken this to a level which is beyond normal comprehension. Now, all the questions that I can see are questions which haunt in every Indian average mind as to war movies in India. Why don't they make any sense? What you have done in your book, and I'm just trying to tell the audience that you probably explain every bit of it, including what our mythology was and what our reality is today, and how there is this disconnect between the earlier times and the war movies depiction today. It's all there in your book. It's just that 1 hour is too less to really discuss every facet. But I think even in that, given the hour and the limited time, you have been able to cover many aspects and clear many issues. I'm sure this topic would continue to progress further and further as we see better and better war movies. Like I said, Shesha was a better one than probably LOC. And I wish all the movie buffs like myself better viewing and happy viewing. Thank you very much, and thank you, General HK, for giving me this opportunity.
Thanks, Hemant. Thank you very much for having me on.
Just 2-3 minutes. Thank you, Professor Sameer Chopra and Gadkari. When we were thinking who will moderate this book, we thought, let us get some film people. Satya Saran said she has read your book. But then I said the real stuff will only come out when we go back to a person who has served in army, that he may be able to get the best out of Samir, what he is wanting to say. Because the book has got so much. And that's where I think General Gadkari did a great job uh, on this, I would say, a phenomenal book. And quoting you, brave people are the one who continue to function. Great point. And you brought in the seriousness of making war films. There should be no glibness or flippant attitude. Let us look at 5, 6 movies which are going to come. One is the Bongo Bandhu, which is being made by Sham Benegal, and there are some observations from Bangladesh side. It is sponsored by both countries. Pippa will be out next month. Pippa is a PT-76 tank, 1971 war. So, and 3 movies on the PVCs are going to come. So let us see how this talk which we have done today, how will we analyze these movies which are coming. There are hundreds of more stories which are coming out, and uh, I am 100% sanguine that war movie making in India will go to greater heights, and hopefully they should be war. But your point that as we go bigger, the chances of war going bigger are important. Today only somebody wrote, we have to be on alert. So that is a very nice point which you said. When it comes to recruitment, even if you go today, if you have to select 100, there are 10,000 who are coming for recruitment. So, uh, great. I think it has been the best way to wind up our 12 sessions of the Military Literature Festival, which have been held on Zoom for our season 2. On 5th, we have 4 sessions which are live, followed by an award ceremony. And then we wait for next year, sometime in October, to see what happens in 2023. Grateful thanks to all the audiences and Lucknow University and the students and Dr. Nishi Pandey for being here. And all the very best. We will look forward to the next book, Professor Dr. Sabir Chopra. You brought light to today's session. Thank you.